Good morning. We want to thank each and every one of you for coming out this morning to discuss what this caucus believes to be one of the critical and most important issues facing not just our state, but issues that we're continuing to hear about all across the country. But today we're here specifically to talk about things that are happening with Louisiana State Police, and not just the Ronald Green incident, which many of you know has been, again, we've been shined in a national light because of the Ronald Green death. And I think that it's ironic to point out that on 5 years ago on this exact same day, many of us were standing before many of you, the media, after the killing of Alton Sterling. And I think back to 5 years ago, and I know I personally and many of my colleagues that are standing behind me that were here during that time, our immediate thought was to call in state police, bring in Louisiana State Police to investigate this, because we trusted that agency and we wanted to make sure that there was a layer of trust in the community with that investigation with Alton Sterling. And here we are 5 years later, and while there's been a settlement, and it is the opinion of many of us, there still has not been justice for Alton Sterling's death, because we have someone who technically can still be a police officer, who we know continued to work, continue to secure locations, continue to carry a gun, and we knew that he was responsible. And 5 years later, we know that there were many instances that should have been brought out, and that gentleman should never have been a police officer from the beginning. But it was nepotism that allowed him to rise through the ranks of BRPD. And now 5 years later, we know of Ronald Green and Aaron Bowman and countless other men, fathers, husbands, uncles who became hashtags because of police violence. And many of you, and first I want to thank the NAACP, because without them, we would have never seen those pictures of Ronald Green's car last year. We would have never started to ask many of the questions that I know many of you guys have asked. But before we talk about our next steps, I do think it's important that we discuss the things that have happened in the last 10 or so months in this building. Many of you know that after George Floyd, that because of the leadership of one of our members, Senator Cleo Fields, that a task force was formed, and this caucus took our responsibility serious, not to just march on the outside and demand and ask for change, but we took our responsibility very seriously and marched into this building and made sure that we passed legislation to address this issue. So I want to call up our Senator Cleo Fields.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Several months ago, a group of young people gathered on these very steps and protests for a shameful condition. And I said to them, listen, you're protesting, and you're protesting peacefully, and your protest without policy change is meaningless. And we committed as a caucus that we will make meaningful policy changes. And we created a task force, and it was a bipartisan task force, and we made meaningful change. We recommended 18 changes, and 16 of them passed this legislature this past session. Before this task force, police officers across the state were able to turn on and turn off of their body cameras. This legislature, in a bipartisan fashion, passed legislation that will require a uniform application of body cameras. So no longer officers will be able to, at their will, turn on and off their body cameras, as well as their dash cameras. So we will have uniform application of body cameras and dash cameras. We also will have a duty to intervene. So when a police officer sees another officer acting outside of the law, that officer will have a duty to intervene. No-knock warrants. We passed meaningful legislation to deal with the no-knock warrant. Chokeholds. Louisiana will no longer allow chokeholds unless the life of an officer or the life of a third party is in danger. So we've passed meaningful legislation this past session in a bipartisan way, and I want to thank the members of this caucus who led the way, and want to thank the members of this legislature who made it happen. And I'd like to turn it back over to Chairman James.
Thank you, Senator Fields. And one of the things that we've learned in the past 5 years, the community after an in-custody death, we always get several questions. We always get a lot of concern from not just the folks that we represent, but folks all across the state, and they want to know three things. And the first thing is they want transparency. And a lot of times I think that we make the mistake of thinking that the transparency is owed to us, the elected officials, or sometimes even you, the media, because you guys want to put it out there and want the community to see it. And sometimes even the community is really upset and they want that transparency. But honestly, the transparency is for the family. The transparency should ensure that that mother, Ms. Mona, who I've had the opportunity, and many of us have had the opportunity to talk to several times, transparency helps Ms. Mona and Alana and Aaron Bowman's family answer the questions of what happened to their loved one. And we were able to fight and ensure that after leaks, that family finally got at least a small bit of transparency. And then the second thing is what Senator Fields talks about. The community demands of us to come to this building and fight for change, to reform systems, and that's what we did. There were also changes at Louisiana State Police, and I don't want those to go unnoticed as well. We have new leadership there. We have a new colonel. We have a more diverse set of lieutenant colonels than we've seen in the department's history. And we recognize that. We know that Colonel Davis has gone in on the ground. He's instituted monumental changes that many of us support. And he's continuing to make changes every single day. But what we are learning story after story after story is that what happened in Troop F, what's happened in the state police, is much more than one man can solve. It's much more that he can do. He cannot simply continue to reform that agency and restore trust at the same time trying to cover up what we all know is a massive and systemic cover-up within that department. So today what we are doing is sending a letter to the United States Department of Justice, our Attorney General, Merrick Garland, and we're asking for a full-scale, top-to-bottom patterns and practice investigation, not just into Troop F, into the entire Louisiana State Police. Through countless conversations, we've heard that be it the law, be it the State Police Commission rules, bars certain people from being called into question. It bars certain documents being reviewed. It bars certain discipline being reviewed. We don't have the authority to do it, but we know the federal government has the authority to do it. We're writing a letter to the U.S. Attorney asking that he implement that full-scale, top-to-bottom patterns and practice to make sure that there are no systemic violations of constitutional rights or federal statutory laws by the hands of Louisiana State Police. And let me say this, because way too often there's this pitting of one side against each other. We did not come to this decision lightly. And I want to personally thank some of those troopers who we know, Albert Paxton, who's come out, Carl Cavalier. When we all started these conversations about police reform, we heard consistently from police officers, no one hates a bad officer more than a good officer. And when police officers are in our communities and when there are issues and we bring them to talk to the community, those officers always tell the people that we represent, when you see something, say something. So I want to say thank you to Mr. Paxton and Mr. Cavalier, because they finally practiced what they've been preaching. They said something. They have been the good officers that we've been waiting for to step up and say, look here, go there. And we know that it wasn't an easy decision. And we know that their career may be different. But we owe it not just to the families, but we also owe it to those two brave troopers and other troopers who have continued to shed light on the patterns and practices of the Louisiana State Police. So today we are sending that letter, and I'll let you know what is entailed in the patterns and practice investigation. Our letter will highlight some of what we already know has taken place within the Louisiana State Police. And the Department of Justice will come in and they'll look at the pattern of practice of different stops by state police, searches, arrests, use of force complaints, discriminatory policing, violations of all constitutional rights. That investigation will require them to come here and not just meet with state police, but meet with community stakeholders. They will do a top to bottom investigation. They will send us a report. They may make certain recommendations. Those recommendations may result in an agreement, what we all know to be a consent decree, to require state police to assume certain actions. I think we owe it to the people of our great state to have the federal government to come in and do this full-scale, top-to-bottom patterns and practice to make sure that what we are seeing happen in the state police is eradicated. We want them to look at any and all systematic violations of constitutional rights and violations of federal statutory law. And with that, we'll take any questions. Yes, sir. We have not. Once we send the letter out this afternoon, we'll make the necessary contacts. Our letter will be sent to Mary Garland, of course, the new head of the Civil Rights Division, Kristen Clark. We'll CC her to make sure that she has it, and several members of our caucus. We have relationships. We know folks there, and we'll make sure that this is a top priority, as we have with the Ronald Green investigation. We've talked to Justice about that. We've asked for it to be expedited. We've talked to them about timing, and I want you all to know, and the community to know, that this caucus has not just been resting idly by while these things are continuing to pop up, and story after story is coming. Yes, sir. Have you spoken to the governor about this? And if he supports this move? We talked to the governor about it. Melinda?
I was wondering if you've given the state police a heads up that you're going to be doing this, and what kind of feedback you've gotten from the department.
Administration and the governor's office and top brass at state police, they know and understand the request.
But you don't want to talk about what the reaction was?
I can't talk about whether or not the colonel supports it.
We interviewed Carl Cavalier last week, and he was adamant that people need to go to jail. In light of what you've seen on the body camera footage, do you guys believe that troopers need to go to jail, including possibly former Colonel Reeves?
We've consistently said that we need to see arrest. We've said that from the moment these stories were leaked. Many of us are criminal defense attorney. I see a lot of probable cause on the videos that we've seen. I know that one trooper is no longer with us, but I also see violations from those other troopers. I agree with what we've heard from Mr. Cavalier, and also what we heard from another trooper. There are consistent violations that we see criminally, and folks need to be arrested. And that is one of the reasons why we want the feds to come in, because we know and understand that there may be troopers who are no longer state troopers, but we still paying their retirement. The taxpayers of this great state deserve to know what has happened with state police, and they deserve to know that those issues have been eradicated.
Albert Paxton's case notes show that he was basically stonewalled from the very top, from the troop commander to Colonel Kevin Reeves. What would you like to say about that? The fact that he basically could not do his job, even though he was the investigating trooper for Ronald Reeves' death.
What we said is why we're here today. We need a full-scale investigation. Those folks In my opinion, in many of our positions, those folks should be brought to justice. Again, Mr. Paxton, he has been one of those officers that they consistently tell us about. He's that good officer that's trying to eradicate those bad officers so that badge that he wears can be proudly worn, and that's what we all want. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry. If we were satisfied, we wouldn't be here today.
In terms of the new colonel, he's made a lot of changes and he's changed leadership at Troop and throughout the agency. I guess I'm wondering, why do you think that he won't be able to clean things up on his own?
You know, we want him to continue to focus on improving that agency. We don't believe that he can continue to focus and continue to dig as deep as he's going to be required to dig to uncover up the issues at his department. Through several conversations, we also recognize that there are rules and laws in place that prevent questioning of certain individuals that we know need to be questioned. And we want the colonel to continue to focus on those reform efforts and continue to do his part. And we don't feel that he can adequately do that and continue to keep digging. One more question. Yes, sir.
Do you have full confidence in the colonel that he can do the things that you expect him to do other than this federal investigation?
You know, I think that the colonel has shown in very short order that he has what it takes to attempt to reform his agency. I know that for several years, those reforms didn't take place. I don't remember the last time a trooper has been arrested, and I know that we've had troopers arrested under his leadership, and I know that those weren't easy decisions. But the justice and accountability part that the families are owed and that the community is owed at this point, we believe that it's outside of his hands, and that's why we are asking the federal government to come in and do this patterns and practice to make sure that there are no systemic violations of constitutional rights or issues that run afoul with federal law. Thank you.